On the morning of April 29, 1862, a man climbed the steps of a gallows in Richmond, Virginia. He was 40 years old. He had been bedridden for weeks, too sick to stand without help. Two guards had to support him on either side as he reached the platform. When they put the noose around his neck, the trapdoor failed. The mechanism jammed. He dropped and stopped short. The rope held him there, half strangled, still alive. They took the noose off. They helped him stand. They put the noose on again. His last recorded words were, "I suffer a double death." The Confederacy hanged Timothy Webster that morning for one reason. They were embarrassed. This British-born Englishman had walked into the heart of Richmond, shaken hands with Jefferson Davis's Secretary of War, been personally appointed as an official courier on the Confederacy's most secret intelligence route, and fed every letter, every name, every plan straight to Alan Pinkerton and Abraham Lincoln. He hadn't switched sides out of money. He hadn't been blackmailed into it. He'd chosen America, the Union, the Republic, the idea that a nation built on a promise to its own people was worth dying for over the country that had made him. This is his story. Timothy Webster was born on March 12, 1822, in the village of New Haven in Sussex County, England, a small coastal town on the English Channel, the kind of place where a working-class family lived close to the water and thought mostly about getting by. He was 8 years old when his parents packed up their household and boarded a ship for America. It was 1830, and the Websters were part of a quiet, steady wave of English working families making the crossing not out of desperation, but out of ambition, the belief that the New World offered something the Old World didn't, which was room. They settled in Princeton, New Jersey, a university town in the mid-Atlantic, and Timothy grew up there, educated, English accented, American by circumstance and choice. He was a large man physically, broad-shouldered, sociable, with a face that people found easy to trust. He had what Alan Pinkerton would later describe, with characteristic admiration, as an inexhaustible fund of anecdote. He could talk to anyone about anything and make them feel that he was the most natural companion they'd ever met. He had 11 siblings. He married young, a woman named Charlotte Sprowls in 1841, and they had 4 children, 2 of whom died young. By the 1840s, Webster had moved to New York City. He worked first as a machinist, a trade skill, practical and physical. Then he joined the New York police force, working his way up through a department that was simultaneously building itself into something resembling a modern institution and destroying itself through corruption and political patronage. In those years on the force, Webster learned things that couldn't be taught from a book: how to read a room, how to remember a face, how to listen without appearing to listen, and how to be exactly whoever the situation required. Around 1853, a police captain recommended him to a Scottish-born detective who had set up an agency in Chicago. His name was Alan Pinkerton. He was 3 years older than Webster, also foreign-born, and had built a private investigative agency that was already earning a national reputation for results. Pinkerton liked Webster immediately. What he saw in him was something rare, a man who could perform a convincingly different version of himself in any company and leave no one the wiser. Webster joined Pinkerton's National Detective Agency in 1856. By the time the Civil War began, he was already regarded as one of Pinkerton's ablest operatives. What came next would test exactly how far that ability could carry a man. To understand why Timothy Webster's story matters beyond the details of one man's courage, you need to understand what was happening between Britain and the Confederate States of America in 1861. When the Southern states seceded and the war began, the Confederacy's entire strategic theory of survival rested on one premise: that Britain would intervene, not out of sympathy for slavery, though British aristocratic opinion was often dismissive of what they called Yankee democracy, but out of economic necessity. The Confederacy supplied roughly 78% of Britain's cotton in the years before the war. Hundreds of thousands of mill workers in Lancashire and Manchester depended on Southern cotton to keep the looms running. Confederate President Jefferson Davis and his advisors called it King Cotton, and they believed it like a religion. If the Union blockade cut off the cotton supply long enough, Britain would break the blockade for them, recognize the Confederacy as a sovereign nation, and turn a rebellion into a fait accompli. They were not entirely wrong about the interest. British Prime Minister Lord Palmerston was privately hostile to the United States and believed a divided America would weaken a rival power while opening new markets for British manufactures. The Chancellor of the Exchequer, William Gladstone, publicly declared his support for Confederate recognition. Shipyards in Liverpool were building warships for the Confederate Navy. British blockade runners were the Confederacy's commercial lifeline. At one point in 1862, the question of British and French mediation, which would have effectively forced a negotiated peace and de facto Confederate independence, was seriously under consideration at the highest levels of European government. Lincoln's Secretary of State William Seward responded to every hint of recognition with a clear warning. Any country that recognized the Confederacy was choosing war with the United States. But warnings only matter if the other side believes you can back them up. And in 1861, that was an open question. This is the context in which a British-born man who had become American by conviction began spying for the Union inside the Confederate capital. He wasn't just gathering troop numbers and fortification positions. He was helping to hold the line in an international chess match where the wrong move could bring the world's most powerful empire into the war on the wrong side. He understood all of this, and he went anyway. Webster's first major operation before the war officially began set the tone for everything that followed. In February 1861, President-elect Abraham Lincoln was preparing to travel from Springfield, Illinois to Washington for his inauguration. The route took his train through Baltimore, Maryland, a city seething with secessionist sentiment, sitting barely 40 miles from the capital on the wrong side of the Mason-Dixon line. Baltimore was, in the months after secession began, a powder keg with a very short fuse. Webster had been infiltrating Baltimore's secessionist networks for Pinkerton, working under a cover identity. He'd worked his way into the confidence of a group called the Sons of Liberty, a shadow organization of Confederate sympathizers planning, among other things, to assassinate the incoming president as his train passed through the city's station. The plan, as Webster reported it to Pinkerton, was specific. In the chaos and crowd of a Baltimore train station, with the police likely complicit or at least indifferent, a group of men intended to shoot Lincoln during the transfer between rail lines. It wasn't a rumor. Webster had been inside the room when some of the plans were discussed. Pinkerton moved. Lincoln's train was rerouted. The president-elect was smuggled into Washington on a different train, at a different hour, in disguise, a decision that historians still argue about in terms of whether it was necessary, but one that unquestionably kept Lincoln alive for the moment he was needed most. The Confederacy lost its best chance to end the war before it began. Timothy Webster, a man who had been born a British subject, had saved the American president's life. He was 38 years old. He'd been in the country for 31 years. By now, nobody who met him would have thought of him as anything other than exactly what he was, an American. When the war started in April 1861, Pinkerton was hired by General George McClellan to set up the Union's intelligence operation, the first organized espionage effort in American military history. Webster became his most valuable asset in the field. His first missions took him deep into Confederate territory. He traveled through Mississippi, Tennessee, Arkansas, and Kentucky, posing as a Southern gentleman and Confederate sympathizer. He had the English accent, an asset rather than a liability, since British sympathy for the Confederate cause was well known, and a British-born Confederate admirer was entirely plausible. He had the manners. He had the ease in company. He sat down at tables with Confederate officers, shared their food, heard their plans, and remembered everything. He crossed into Kentucky. He crossed into Tennessee. He pumped fellow train passengers for information the way a man talks politics in a tavern, casually, without apparent agenda, letting the other person think they were leading the conversation. Then he'd slip across the border into Union territory and report everything to Pinkerton. His fieldcraft was something Pinkerton described repeatedly in dispatches with barely concealed admiration. Webster could walk into a Confederate camp, share soldiers' rations, joke with corporals and privates, and within the same afternoon sit down seriously with a brigadier general and be received as a peer. It wasn't charm exactly, it was something more structural than that. He understood people. He understood what they wanted to believe, and he gave them reasons to believe it. In Maryland, he infiltrated the Knights of Liberty, a secret organization planning to march 10,000 pro-Confederate men on Washington, D.C. He got himself initiated into their inner circle. Then he passed the intelligence to Pinkerton, who arranged for Webster to be publicly arrested along with the other members to preserve his cover. The planned attack on Washington never came. But his greatest performance was still ahead of him. In late 1861, Pinkerton sent Webster to Richmond, Virginia, the Confederate capital and the most dangerous city in North America, for a Union spy. He went with Hattie Lawton, a fellow Pinkerton agent who posed as his wife. They checked into the Monumental Hotel, one of the city's finest establishments, and set about becoming fixtures of Richmond society. Webster presented himself as a wealthy, ardently pro-Confederate gentleman, a man of property, of breeding, deeply committed to the Southern cause, and with good connections in the border states. Richmond in 1861 was a city electric, with the feeling of a new nation being born. The Confederate War Department was there. Jefferson Davis's White House was there. The streets were full of officers in gray uniforms, politicians arguing the merits of strategy, society hostesses competing to demonstrate their patriotism. It was a small world, tightly networked, built on social trust, which made it, paradoxically, vulnerable to a man who knew how to perform social trust convincingly. Webster performed it perfectly. Within weeks, he had cultivated relationships at the highest levels of Confederate government. He attended parties. He attended church, the same churches as the generals and cabinet members. He talked to everyone, listened to everyone, and remembered everything. His reports to Pinkerton covered Richmond's fortifications, troop strengths, morale among the soldiery, food prices, supply routes, and the identities of Confederate agents operating in Washington and Baltimore. Then something happened that defied the odds even for a man of Webster's abilities. Judah P. Benjamin, the Confederate Secretary of War and one of the sharpest legal minds in America, personally recruited Timothy Webster to serve as an official courier on the Confederacy's secret line, the clandestine mail route that ran between Richmond, Baltimore, and Washington, carrying official Confederate dispatches and private correspondence between Southern sympathizers in the North and the Confederate government in the South. Benjamin trusted Webster. He trusted him enough to hand him the communications of the Confederacy's entire espionage network in the border states. Webster carried the letters. He steamed them open, read every word, copied the names and contents, resealed them, and delivered them to their addresses. Then he reported every detail to Pinkerton. Between 200 and 800 letters passed through his hands each month. By operating as the Confederacy's own courier, Webster was simultaneously running their mail system and destroying their network from within. Rebel spy rings in Washington were identified and broken up. Confederate agents were arrested. Plans were compromised before they could be acted on. From inside the Confederate War Department, a British-born Union agent was dismantling the Confederacy's intelligence operation, and nobody in Richmond suspected a thing. In February 1862, Webster fell ill. It was inflammatory rheumatism, a condition that comes on fast and hits hard, inflaming the joints, causing excruciating pain, and leaving the body temporarily unable to function. Webster, who had been sleeping on cold ground during his scouting missions and traveling in winter conditions for months, suddenly couldn't move without agony. He was bedridden at the Monumental Hotel, unable to make his courier runs, unable to communicate with Pinkerton. Weeks passed. Pinkerton, increasingly worried, made a decision that he would later characterize as a mistake he regretted for the rest of his life. He sent two other agents, John Scully and Price Lewis, to Richmond to find Webster and determine his condition. There was a problem he hadn't adequately accounted for. A few weeks earlier, Union officials in Washington had released 3 Confederate women from prison, including the notorious Rose O'Neal Greenhow, one of the most famous spies of the war. Scully and Lewis had both been involved in questioning those women. When Scully and Lewis arrived in Richmond and checked into a hotel, they happened to encounter people who had seen them at those interrogations. They were recognized instantly. Scully and Lewis were arrested. They were sentenced to hang. Facing the gallows, Scully broke. The exact circumstances are disputed. Some accounts say Confederate interrogators sent a fake Catholic priest to hear his confession and extracted the information that way. Whatever happened, Scully gave Webster up. He told the Confederate authorities that the man who had been running their official mail courier service, who had been personally trusted by Judah Benjamin, who had dined at their tables and worshipped in their churches, was the head of Pinkerton's espionage operation in Richmond. Webster was still bedridden when they came for him. A fellow prisoner in the Richmond jail reportedly looked at the man being brought in and said, "My God, they will send the dead here next." In a sense, they had. The trial of Timothy Webster was not a long one. The evidence was overwhelming, and the mood of the Confederate military court was not deliberative. General John Winder, the provost marshal who'd been personally duped by Webster for months, had been made to look like a fool in front of the entire Confederate government. Jefferson Davis's administration wanted its pound of flesh. The embarrassment of what Webster had done, how far inside the most sensitive corridors of the Confederacy he had penetrated, how much damage he had inflicted, demanded a response that would deter anyone else who might try the same. The court's verdict was brief, the court having maturely considered the evidence adduced, and 2/3 concurring therein, they find the prisoner guilty of the charge. Whereupon, 2/3 the court concurring, it was adjudged that the accused suffer death by hanging. When Pinkerton received the news, he went to Lincoln directly. Lincoln sent a formal warning to Jefferson Davis through Secretary of War Edwin Stanton. If Webster was executed, the Union would retaliate by hanging Confederate spies currently held in northern prisoner camps. Until that point, both sides had observed an informal arrangement of imprisoning captured spies and exchanging them in prisoner swaps. Webster's execution would be the first, and it would end that arrangement. Davis and his government ignored the threat. They had their own reasons, and they were not primarily strategic. They were personal and political. General Winder wanted revenge. Davis wanted to make an example. Pinkerton and one of McClellan's staff officers went to Richmond under a flag of truce and requested Webster's release directly. They were turned away. On April 29, 1862, the guards came for Webster at Camp Lee. He was sick enough that walking was difficult. He made the gallows with help. The first drop failed, the mechanism jammed, and he was left strangling without dying. They reset the gallows. They put the noose on a second time. "I suffer a double death." He was buried in Richmond. Scully and Lewis, who had betrayed him, were released in a prisoner exchange 19 months later. Pinkerton never forgave himself for sending them. He wrote in his memoir years afterward, "No braver nor truer man died during the War of the Rebellion than Timothy Webster." In 1871, 9 years after Webster's execution, Allen Pinkerton sent 2 agents back to Richmond with a singular mission: find the grave and bring him home. They located him with the help of Elizabeth Van Lew, a Richmond-born Union sympathizer who had run her own spy network out of her family's mansion throughout the war, one of the most remarkable intelligence operations on either side. She knew where the executed spies had been buried. Webster's body was exhumed and transporting north to Onaga, Illinois, where he was buried in the town cemetery, next to his father, who had died there in 1860, having lived long enough to see his English-born son become thoroughly, permanently American. His son, Timothy Jr., had followed his father's example and joined the Union Army in 1862, 3 months after his father's execution. He was wounded at the Battle of Bryce's Crossroads in Mississippi in 1864 and taken to a Confederate prison in Mobile, Alabama, where his leg was amputated. He died there on July 4, 1864, Independence Day, an irony so on the nose it seems almost invented, except that it happened. Father and son, now buried side by side in Illinois, both of them had believed in something enough to die for it. Neither of them had been born to it. The British government, for its part, never intervened in the American Civil War. The cotton diplomacy failed. Britain had larger reserves of cotton in 1861 than the Confederacy had anticipated, and the Union's implicit threat to destroy trade between the two nations if Britain recognized the South proved more persuasive than any amount of King Cotton leverage. The Confederacy's gamble that British economic necessity would force diplomatic recognition never paid off. By 1863, after Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation and framed the war explicitly as a fight against slavery, British public opinion, especially among the working class, made official support for the Confederacy politically impossible. But in 1861 and early 1862, that outcome was not certain. Britain's intervention was a real possibility. The Confederate spy network running through Baltimore and Washington, the very network Webster was simultaneously operating and dismantling from inside, was a real threat. The intelligence he provided about that network, the agents he exposed, the plans he compromised, mattered in the broader calculation of whether the war would remain a purely American contest or become something much larger and more dangerous. Timothy Webster had been born English. He died American, not by accident of geography, but by the deliberate choice of a man who understood exactly what he was doing and did it anyway. He is not in the history books the way Grant is, or Sherman, or Lincoln. There is no monument with his name on it that I'm aware of. He is a footnote in most accounts of the war, a detail in chapters about the Pinkerton Agency. But the man who was born a subject of the British Crown, who chose to live as an American, and who gave his life to make sure that America survived, deserves better than a footnote. He always did. If this story found you, subscribe and leave a like. It helps more people find the history that doesn't make the textbooks. And drop a comment. What do you think broke Webster in the end? Was it the illness? Pinkerton's mistake of sending Scully and Lewis, or was it always just a matter of time before a man running that deep inside enemy territory ran out of luck? The argument is worth having.